Hello and welcome back, everybody. In this lecture, we're going to be focusing our attention on a type of learning that we in behaviorism call operant conditioning. We're going to go over a lot of the details about it and also link it to some more kind of everyday applications. But before we do that, I want to start by providing us some context of how we got here. If you remember in our last class, we started talking about a type of approach to psychology that we called behaviorism. We talked about the goals of behaviorists, what their philosophical stances were on how to approach studying the mind, and we discussed how a lot of their work focused on learning, in particular two types of learning, what we call classical conditioning, or learning how to associate stimuli together, and something called operant conditioning. We spent almost the entire class last time after defining what behaviorists do and what their real ideas are, focusing in on classical conditioning, talking about the specific components to it, all the applications tied to it, and some nuances to classical conditioning that broaden the application base to this specific type of learning. I then, at the very end of that video, mentioned that there was still one other type of learning that we wanted to spend a lot of time discussing, something that sort of complemented classical conditioning because, well, classical conditioning, though it might be interesting, didn't apply to every situation. He said that there are some situations that neither classical conditioning nor operant conditioning apply, but a good pair with classical conditioning is operant conditioning, this learning to do things in specific environments, not because you're reacting to stimuli anymore, but because you're making this volitional response to specific environments that pop up. Let's first, before we talk about operant conditioning and the terms around it, also not only get kind of perspective in the class on this, but some historical perspective on where operant conditioning came from and where a lot of the terminology eventually evolved from. To do this, to talk about where operant conditioning came from, we actually have to go a little bit further back than the person that coined the term operant conditioning. In particular, we have to go back to the work of a gentleman named Edward Thorndike, who, when this behavioral movement started to pick up in the early 1900s, decided that he himself wanted to explore where lots of overt behaviors were coming from, and in particular, he wanted to understand where lots of sort of unpredictable novel behaviors were developing. So he decided to design his own apparatus to study these behavioral principles. If we look back at classical conditioning, we have all of these labs with dogs and other animals that were used to understand the principles of classical conditioning. Many other behaviorists created their own tools and techniques to study their concepts of either learning or just behavioral principles. Thorndike, in his research, designed these things that he called puzzle boxes, these very elaborate contraptions that varied from box to box that all had some kind of consistent themes within them. One of the consistent themes was that all of them had a lot of sort of random contraptions connected to them that looked sort of out of place, but could potentially be tied to allowing the boxes that could be closed to eventually open. The other consistency within all the boxes was that there was always, within each box, a specific contraption that would trigger a door or a latch into opening, and in doing so, allow whatever was put in these puzzle boxes to get out. And the subjects in all of Thorndike's experiments were cats. What he would do is take a cat, place it inside these puzzle boxes, and just record all the things the cat did while it was in the puzzle box, and oftentimes trying its best to get out of these boxes. And what he was able to do after doing this for many, many years is come up with a lot of laws and principles of behavior that he thought not only applied to the cats in these boxes, but to humans and other species in kind. We could, if we had the time, go over all the different laws of behavior that Thorndike said were critical in his concept of what he called instrumental learning. But we don't, in an intro class, have the ability to go over all of the different ideas that Thorndike came up with in his work with these puzzle boxes. You might encounter it in a psych of learning class somewhere down the road, or if you do happen to somehow randomly fall into a behaviorism class, which isn't that popular nowadays, but occasionally it will pop up, see more about Thorndike. What I want to do in this specific class is just focus on a few of the laws that he talked about so we can understand some of the principles that he came up with. And then I'd like to narrow in on one specific law that he focused on, something that does pertain to operant conditioning a lot. Before we get to that one, let's look at just two of the more application-based laws that Thorndike was able to come up with, and we can see exhibiting some indications that it works in our everyday experiences. One of the laws he talked about was something called the law of recency. This law suggested that when he put the cats in the box, one of the things that often could be used as a predictor of what the cats would do in a new box was just what they did in the previous box. Think of it as an explanation that we're all creatures of habit. We tend to do whatever we've done recently more than something new almost every single time. This obviously is sort of an intuitive thing, but if you think about it over the long run, you can sort of see it finding its way into our decisions that we make and the actions that we commit that we think are sort of random. Some of you might have had those moments in your life where you started going to a specific restaurant over and over again. Not necessarily because you loved it, not necessarily because it was your favorite thing in the world, but because it just sort of found its way into your routine. And breaking that thing from your routine was pretty challenging. But I'm also guessing that, well, once you stopped doing that thing, once you stopped going to that restaurant, reverting back to it, finding your way back to that thing that had become a part of your routine might seem very challenging or difficult to do. This is what the law of recency is all about. This tendency for us to sort of just get into some type of flow, some type of system, and just do those things over and over again unless those things aren't available to us anymore. Something that was pretty related to this was something called the law of availability, which suggests that there's certain behaviors that are sort of easier to evoke in specific situations than others. Essentially, it suggested that we're sort of primed to do specific behaviors more than others when we find ourselves in certain situations. This could mean that for the cats, they might have a tendency to be more inclined to, when placed in these puzzle boxes, bite at the bar than, say, push up against the grate. It's not necessarily one that's as easily applicable to other individuals, and it's a little bit more specific, but again, it was one of the many laws that he came up with that seems to make intuitive sense, even if we don't necessarily celebrate it as this amazing breakthrough that we need to talk about for hundreds of years later on. In fact, my guess is that we probably wouldn't be talking about Thorndike in a general psychology class if not for the last law that you see listed here, the one called the law of effect, which is probably the most intuitive and obvious law that he came up with. This law suggested that the cats, when trying to figure out what to do, tended to operate on the logical premise of if something could get them out of a box, they'd do that behavior, and if it never seemed to get them out of any of their boxes, well, they'd be less likely to do that behavior. In layman's terms, we do what benefits us, and we tend to not do the things that don't benefit us. Now, this might not seem, again, like the most amazing breakthrough of our time, but some behaviors, when looking at this particular law of Thorndike's, thought that there was a nice component to this that, when kind of expanded upon, could really explain a lot of our human behavior, especially when paired with classical conditioning. One of the people that really pushed this idea, sort of championed the notion that this law of effect had lots of utility, was a gentleman named B.F. Skinner. You might remember Skinner from our last class when I mentioned that he coined the phrase radical behaviorism, this kind of acknowledgement that some behaviors maybe took things a little far. His work was the work that actually led to some of the things that we looked at in our last class as well. But if we're looking at where Skinner's ideas came from, many people have surmised that his original concepts, his ideas of what to study as a researcher, came from the work of Thorndike and his research on the law of effect. When Skinner came across this law of effect, he decided to create his own apparatus, things that he called operant chambers, and sometimes you'll run across these if you ever get into a behavioral lab. They're often nowadays called Skinner boxes. Skinner wasn't quite as vain to call them Skinner boxes in front of others. He insisted we should call them operant chambers, and he talked about how we should be describing this specific type of learning as operant conditioning. He said that what we can do when studying operant conditioning in these weird little test boxes that he created is look at how changing different types of consequences not only create different types of behaviors, but can impact things like the rate and strength of different behaviors that we elicit. And once he started developing these operant chambers and creating all of these different tools that he could use to study this type of learning, he started to develop some really critical terminology that defined operant conditioning really since he introduced them. If we're looking at what operant conditioning is all about, again, it's a byproduct of the law of effect. It's this notion that when we look at why we're doing things, a lot of times the reason behind it is because of the consequences that we've encountered in the past. Skinner very aptly talked about operant conditioning as being all about what he called the ABCs of learning. A standing for antecedents, being the environments we find ourselves in or the cues that we're given. B's being the behaviors that we elicit in those environments when they pop up. And C's being the consequences to those behaviors. He suggested that once we went through one of these cycles, our behaviors that we commit in these antecedents are going to be more or less likely depending upon the consequences that we encounter. If we do find ourselves in a situation where a consequence gets us to do that behavior more often, he said we should define those consequences as a reinforcement. If we find ourselves in a situation and do a behavior less after we've encountered specific consequences, well, then we should call that type of consequence a punishment. Now, there was lots of debate over what made a reinforcer and a punisher, but Skinner suggested that maybe we should just focus on the surface level. We should just talk about reinforcers as those things that trigger behaviors more in a situation and punishers as things that trigger behaviors less in a situation, and not worry about all the extra details surrounding it. Now, this might seem fairly basic, right? It seems like it's probably just adding some basic terms to the ideas of the law of effect that Thorndike had introduced before Skinner. But Skinner went well beyond that specific type of definitions. He decided to add nuances to this reinforcement and punishment and tie some of the concepts that we've already talked about with classical conditioning to some of these ideas to really expand upon how applicable operant conditioning could be and how we could explain the subtle differences within types of operant conditioning in situations that we encounter. One of the first things that he introduced to expand upon operant conditioning was the concepts of what he called positive and negative components to both reinforcement and punishment. Now, I honestly wish I had a time machine. I could go back and tell Skinner that those terms have a real bad effect on students' ability to retain them, because we tend to think of positive in layman's terms as good stuff and negative as bad stuff. But in Skinner's ideas, he used the positive and negative terms as more being about addition concepts. Positive being this indicator that something's being added in the consequence, negative being all about something either being taken away or just not happening as a consequence of a specific behavior. One of the ways that we can really see this differentiation is if we look at the differences between what we call positive and negative reinforcement. Let's say I want you to get a behavior to occur more when you find yourself in a specific situation. It could potentially get you to do that behavior more by giving you some type of consequence that's desirable when you commit that behavior. Let's say I want you to do your homework more, so every time you do your homework, I give you some money. Let's say instead, I want you to, when you start feeling sore or achy or hurt yourself, get you to be more inclined to take medicine. One of the best ways to do that, of course, is to have you just randomly take medicine when you find yourself sore and have that pain reduced. The odds are pretty good if that works. The next time you're feeling pain or you find yourself in that similar situation, you're going to be more inclined to take the medicine. Not again because something's being added necessarily, but because the pain is being taken away. That's what makes that medicine a negative reinforcer. It seems counterintuitive, but that's how the math worked in these new terms that Skinner introduced. And we also have positive and negative components to punishment. Again, positive indicating that something's being added as a consequence, and negative being an indication that something's being taken away or not happening as a consequence. A classic example that's often used in animal training for positive punishment are those shock collars, or sometimes even water spray collars that are used on dogs who bark. If you've ever encountered a dog with one of these things on and are wondering what are the antecedents, just consider the antecedents another dog, a male person, maybe another person walking by, and the behavior that's elicited that the trainer wants to remove is the barking that ensues when these individuals or these things come into play. Well, if the dog barks when they see that male person or other dog or whatever, the thing that happens isn't something's taken away, but instead the dog gets shocked. And what that consequence does is it lessens the likelihood that that dog is going to bark again the next time they encounter the male person or another dog or whatever was the trigger, the antecedent to that barking. Again, it seems counterintuitive to call it that positive punishment because we have this notion that positive is always good things, but it's not, right? It's about addition. And because in the environment, a behavior we're trying to get to occur less in the environment is curbed or kind of eroded through the introduction of something in the environment, we're going to call it positive and we're going to call it punishment because the behavior is occurring less often the next time that environment pops up. Negative punishment, much like positive punishment again, is going to get a behavior to occur less, but as the name implies, the negative component to it, we're not getting a behavior to occur less because of some consequence that's introduced. We're talking about getting a behavior to occur less because something is taken away, removed as a result of a behavior happening. And the classic example for many classes like this is something like a swear jar, where every time somebody does something, they lose money. Maybe they in this case, use specific swear words or do certain mean things. They have to lose some money, pay that into a jar, and that obviously is not only negative in terms of our perception of it, but negative because something is being lost. That's what makes it negative. There's other types of negative punishment as well, where we might do something significantly less because something doesn't happen because we didn't do that thing. My personal example is when I try to make really bad jokes in certain situations and I get met with lots of silence and stares. Right? That silence, that lack of a response is usually a great way to encourage me not to make awkward, weird jokes in specific situations where I have the inclination to do it. Negative punishment. Now that we've defined these, let's move on and look at some other applications that Skinner and people studying operant conditioning started to explore. I almost forgot one thing that I decided to add. What I thought we'd do, just to have everybody get one chance, well, actually two chances, to determine if they understand these components to operant conditioning, is look at these scenarios that you see pictured, well, one here and one in the next slide, to see if you can identify what type of conditioning is occurring. Now, in this first image, you see a young boy who's dropped a bowl of something that seems to be spilling all over the floor and start crying. The dad's decided, for some inexplicable reason, not to necessarily clean up the mess, but try to dissuade his son from crying. So he pushes a button that activates this lever that causes some type of mallet to bang against the door. He then says to his son, "Uh-oh, Danny, sounds like the monster in the basement has heard you crying again. Let's be real quiet and hope he goes away." The question I have for you is, what type of conditioning is the father trying to do on Danny at this point? Now, if you need a second to think, by all means, pause me. If not, I'll pause for just a second, and then we'll walk our way through it. Okay, for those of you that did not pause me, let's break it down. First question you're always going to ask is this behavior occurring more or less when this antecedent comes up again as a result of this situation? If the behavior is going to be more likely to occur, we're always going to call whatever the consequence is a reinforcer. If the behavior is going to be less likely to occur in the future when this happens, well, then we're going to call the consequence a punishment. And my guess is most of you probably realize pretty quickly that Danny is much less likely to cry when he spills whatever he spilled in the future as a result of this consequence. Regardless of whether or not we approve of what the father's doing, or whether or not we think he should be doing something else, we are going to define his behavior as a punishment, simply because it's making Danny do this behavior less in the future. Again, we're sticking with operant conditioning terms, not parenting terms or other terms that we might have encountered before this class. Then we ask, after we've determined that this is punishment, is this positive or negative punishment? And again, we go back to the consequence to figure out the answer to that. We ask ourselves, is this behavior being curbed? Is it stopping because something was introduced after he committed this behavior, or something was taken away? I know many of you can talk yourself into circles around this, but I promise there is a right answer here. In this case, a monster was definitely introduced right after he committed this behavior. And this monster that was introduced is the thing that's getting him to cry less in the future. That means what we're looking at here is an example of positive punishment for Danny's crying. Now, there's lots of ways to expand upon this, talking about how other behaviors that Danny could commit could be operantly conditioned in the future. But for this specific example, with everything that we have here, the correct answer is that it is positive punishment for Danny. Let's look at another one. Now, in this case, you see a parent who inexplicably decides to put two pacifiers in his ears instead of putting it in his crying child's mouth, and the other spouse says, "John, the pacifiers are for her," kind of indicating that maybe they shouldn't have been shoved in his ears. The question that we have here is, what type of operant conditioning is occurring right now for the father? Not the child, but for the father. Again, it might take a second. If you need to pause me, do it. And afterwards, we'll try to answer this question, dissect it. All right. So for those of you that have come back or just decided you already know the answer, so you don't need to pause me, let's break it down. Is John more or less likely to do this if it is something that's helping him? What's the antecedent? Well, the antecedent is the child's crying. What's the behavior he decided to do? The behavior he decided to do is stuff the pacifiers in his ears. Now, if that takes away the pain, which it seems to be doing, is he more or less likely to do it in the future the next time the baby cries? And maybe we need to follow this a little bit longer and see what happens to him after his wife kind of confronts him about this. But just on the surface, we would probably suggest or say that he's oddly more likely to do this the next time the event happens, so we're going to call this specific type of consequence a reinforcement. What's happening? Well, why is he doing it more likely to do it in the future? He's probably more likely to do it because the annoying sound, frustration, whatever it is, sort of went away when he committed this behavior. The fact that this problem is going away as a result of the behavior means that we're looking at negative reinforcement. I know, again, we can sometimes talk ourselves into circles and get ourselves confused, but for operant conditioning, if you focus on what's right in front of you, there are correct answers to these. I promise when you encounter exams and other assignments, you're going to be needing to dissect how these things work, and if you know the pattern, how to define it, you should be able to identify these. This was what the beauty in operant conditioning was, and why many people started to get drawn to it. Once Skinner explained it, then people recognized that we could expand it in more than just this specific way. So where else did we expand things? One of the first places that we expanded a lot of the terminology in operant conditioning was to tie some of the ideas that we'd already developed in classical conditioning to operant conditioning. One term that was really critical in classical conditioning was this idea of something called extinction, and of the opposite of learning. If you remember back to classical conditioning, we talked about how extinction was all about breaking the tie between the neutral stimulus that had become a conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. Right? It's when we presented the conditioned stimulus without following it up with an unconditioned stimulus, which eventually led the conditioned stimulus to revert back to a neutral stimulus. That was extinction for classical conditioning. How can we apply it to operant conditioning? Well, here we're not looking at severing ties between stimuli. We're looking at severing ties between behaviors and consequences. So if we want to create extinction in operant conditioning, what we're doing is no longer providing the consequences that were being incurred when a behavior occurs. And by doing that, what we will essentially produce is a return back to what's called behavioral baselines. Now, this might seem a little weird, but you have to understand what we're looking at when we're looking at extinction for operant conditioning, because it can go both ways. Right? Extinction for reinforcement usually just means that the behavior just stops occurring. But extinction for punishment doesn't mean that a behavior doesn't occur. It means we go back to committing that behavior at the rate we were before that behavior started actually being produced, or punished. The classic example of this is the swear jar. Right? If we want to get somebody to stop swearing, we might introduce that swear jar. Again, that's negative punishment that we're looking at. Let's say we stop making somebody put money into a swear jar every time they swear. Well, it doesn't mean, when we're talking about extinction, that they're not going to swear at all. It also doesn't mean that they're going to use a swear word every time they speak. What it means is they're going to go back to the rate that they were swearing before that punishment was incurred. That's where extinction gets a little dicey and more complex than what we had in classical conditioning, but it works nonetheless. There's a logical utility to it. This also applies to the concepts of generalization and discrimination. Generalization and discrimination can be not only for different environments that could produce specific behaviors, but it can also be for specific responses when we talk about operant conditioning. So if we're looking at generalization and discrimination for our responses, like you see in this slide, what we're talking about is expanding the behaviors that we're committing when we find ourselves in specific situations, or keeping the specific behaviors that we're eliciting in specific situations very narrow. If we, say, change a bunch of behaviors because we start to get one reinforced or punished, then we are doing something called response generalization. Let's say for that swear jar example, we're not only stopping our swearing because we start to recognize that there's a specific type of punishment being incurred, but we also stop saying mean things or stop doing violent stuff. In that case, we are generalizing our behavior that we're going to change in specific situations as producing the swearing or producing the violence as a result of that one specific behavior being, well, in this case, punished. That's an example of response generalization. If we instead say, well, in these environments, I'm going to stop swearing, but I'm going to do a lot of other things that are pretty mean or violent, then we're discriminating. We're committing what we call response discrimination, where we're only increasing or decreasing, depending upon the type of consequence, the specific behavior that's being reinforced or punished. Similar to, again, generalization and discrimination in classical conditioning, but very specific to this idea. And much like we saw with classical conditioning, when we apply these concepts to operant conditioning, especially the generalization and discrimination ideas, we can start to see how one specific learning experience can not only be applied to a specific behavior, but it can be applied to a wide range of behaviors and a wide range of situations when behaviors might change as a result of this learning. To make this even more complex, what Skinner and others studying operant conditioning started to do was recognize that a lot of the principles of classical conditioning and complexities of learning could be sort of incorporated into operant conditioning to create very elaborate behaviors or change behaviors in ways that are sort of unpredictable. One of my favorite examples that can be seen again in dog training is a type of reinforcement called shaping, where not only are specific behaviors reinforced, but chained behaviors that start to kind of get closer and closer to a specific behavior that the person wants to elicit gets reinforced. So something that maybe would never be produced on its own could happen in kind of a novel way. If we were in in-person class, right now I'd be showing you a video of B.F. Skinner getting a pigeon that had never spun in the Skinner box before to do a full spin within about a minute. And all he's doing to get this pigeon to do this is rewarding it or reinforcing this turn to the left that the pigeon has to do more and more and more until it gets to the point where it's doing a full spin. And with shaping, if it really is shaping, what the person reinforcing the behavior is doing is kind of coaxing out a little bit more of a turn or a little bit more of a specific move to get that behavior, that novel behavior that again would never be elicited on its own, to start to emerge. Now, this is not obviously a combination of operant and classical conditioning. This is just an expansion of operant conditioning ideas. The pairing of operant conditioning and classical conditioning comes from the next set of terms that you see on this slide that we call primary and secondary reinforcers. Technically, we have primary and secondary punishers as well, but most research focuses on the reinforcer side of things. Primary reinforcers are sort of like unconditioned reflexes. They're not quite the same. But essentially, what we're doing with primary reinforcers is utilizing kind of the basic reaction that certain stimuli have for certain species. A classic example is food with dogs. If a dog does a specific behavior and you give it food, that specific behavior is probably going to happen more often, so we would call the food a reinforcer, and need to stress that dogs don't often need to learn that food is a reinforcer, not a punisher. Same thing with something like warmth or some type of relief of pain, right? All of these things tend to be reinforcers. We're going to do things that cause these outcomes regardless of any past experiences that we've had. That's what makes them primary reinforcers. Let's say we start to tie something to those reinforcers through classical conditioning. One of the more traditional ways to do this is, again, in animal behavior training, where a dog trainer might, say, present a clicker that's paired with food that the dog is already seeing as a primary reinforcer. I don't know how many of you have ever tried this with a dog, but this clicker training is a pretty cool idea that's actually very effective. So what people doing it will do first is they'll play a clicker and then immediately put food in the dog's mouth. Now, the dog doesn't have to do anything for the clicker to be played. All they need is to hear the clicker and get food jammed in their mouth over and over again. And some of you, when you're hearing about this, might immediately identify that this relates very closely, because it is an example of classical conditioning. You've got the neutral stimulus of the clicker that's quickly becoming a conditioned stimulus, because the dogs are realizing that every time that clicker is presented, they're going to get food. Eventually, what that will lead to is not only food being a reinforcer for specific behaviors, but the clicker also being a reinforcer. or dogs, when they do a specific behavior that you want them to do, can either be rewarded or reinforced for doing that behavior by getting food, or they can be reinforced by getting that clicker played. That clicker, and it's become truly a secondary reinforcer, can be just as reinforcing for dogs as food itself. In fact, the advantage to it, and this is why it's used in lots of animal training, is it's not only seen as extremely reinforcing, but it's also much less distracting to dogs. So instead of the dogs being overwhelmed and sort of turning their brain off because they just have to focus on digesting the food, they get the immediate kind of dopamine burst, this excitation from hearing the clicker, but can still focus on what they did to produce that clicker. Now, it's important to note here that for these things to stay secondary reinforcers, they do have to continually be paired with the primary reinforcers that they've been classically conditionally paired to be with. If you keep playing a clicker and never give a dog a treat after playing the clicker, eventually the dog is going to stop using that clicker as a reinforcer. But if it's done correctly, and occasionally food is paired with a clicker, that clicker can be a very powerful tool. The thought is that we've got lots of situations like this in our real world. Right? Things like money or other types of worldly things that we get that don't really, if you think about it, have lots of immediate utility. You sort of have to learn that you want those things. Those things can be very powerful reinforcers, but it takes experience. It takes pairing for us to identify those things as being reinforcers. When we do, well, we can see lots of applications to it. This brings us to another really interesting path that many behaviors started to go down. There was a recognition that not only can we expand learning to lots of different types of stimuli, that we can create very elaborate behaviors, but if we're trying to apply things to the real world, this perfect, pristine lab where every time something happens it gets reinforced in punishment, not really indicative of the real world. And in the real world, very rarely are we on what's called a continuous reinforcement schedule, or even a continuous punishment schedule, where every time we do something, we're going to automatically get reinforced or punished. Instead, we're often on what's called a partial or intermittent reinforcement, or I guess punishment schedule. Punishment schedules that are intermittent are tough to sort of chart out because all we're trying to do is eventually get a behavior to stop. But reinforcement schedules, and the differentiation between continuous and partial ones, are very interesting, and there's lots of real-world applications to them. If we're looking at the most classic versions of partial and intermittent reinforcement schedules, I listed the 4 big ones that are often referenced in an intro class because they tend to find their way into lots of everyday situations. The first 2 that you see listed here are what we call ratio schedules. Schedules where behaviors are reinforced, but only after a certain number of those behaviors have occurred. The first type of ratio schedule is called a fixed ratio schedule. If you're looking for where that is in the chart, you'll see that denoted with the blue line. And you'll see on that blue line that as we're going up, which is the thing that's indicating responses, and as time is passing, we see a nice normal pattern of responses over time that seems to be consistent. And then you see those dashes in these fixed ratio schedules. Those denote when a behavior has been reinforced. So for a fixed ratio schedule, let's say every 10 times something's done, like every 10 times a rat presses a lever, they get food, or they get some type of reinforcement. What these rats will often do once they've pressed a lever 10 times and gotten their reinforcement is commit, as this chart kind of indicates, these things called post-reinforcement pauses, where in the labs, once they get that food, they just sort of sit there and enjoy the food and sort of relish the experience. And only after considerable pause do they go back to pushing that lever 10 times so they can get another piece of food. Now one might surmise that this is just indicating that they don't need to rush through their food and they're not obsessed with the food. They're just taking what they need when they need it. But if you contrast that with the other ratio schedule that you see on this image, what's called a variable ratio schedule, where you can sort of have an average set, but you don't know how many responses are required in a specific situation for that behavior to be reinforced, you get a very different type of response pattern. When rats are in a lab, and let's say we're just looking for an average of 10 responses before behaviors be reinforced, but sometimes it could be 5, sometimes 10, sometimes 15, sometimes 8. It varies from interval to interval, or I guess not interval to interval, we'll keep it simpler. It's varied from reinforcement to reinforcement. The response patterns of these rats is very different. They're frantic. They're constantly pressing the lever on a continual basis. And in fact, when they get the reinforcement, they just grab the food, chuck it in their mouth, and keep pressing the lever. Right? That type of response pattern is not only seen in rats, but we see this in our everyday lives as well. My favorite examples of this is when we look at what happens to us when we say have a coffee cart or a Subway sandwich cart. Many of us, because we know we need to do something X number of times, will respond on a normal basis, have this pattern of responses, but then when we get that free cup or that free sandwich, we often have these post-reinforcement pauses where we don't go back to that place for a while. We might really relish that free cup that we get, but it for some reason takes us a while to respond again. Or if we don't know when we're going to get reinforced with, say, a free cup or something else as a reinforcement, well, we tend to be a little bit more frantic in our behavior. The classic example of people being on a variable ratio schedule is when we sit down in front of a slot machine and keep pulling that lever, not knowing when we're going to get reinforced. In fact, there's been some people that have created videos that highlight how rats in labs on these schedules, in comparison to people sitting in front of a slot machine, look almost identical in both the frantic nature of their behaviors and even sometimes the looks on their faces. Right? These types of things are not just stuff we can create in a lab, but we can see in real-world situations. The same thing can be said for the other types of schedules that you see listed here, which are what we call interval schedules. And we talk about time having to pass before a specific behavior is reinforced. We, much like in the last one, can have both fixed and variable interval schedules. Fixed interval schedules would suggest that what we need is a certain amount of time to pass before a specific behavior is reinforced. A classic example we have in labs is when we put a rat in a lab and say, okay, we're going to set the time for 5 minutes. At 5 minutes, when the rat then presses a lever or does something, that behavior at that point, after the 5 minutes is passed, will now be reinforced. The rats don't quite know exactly when 5 minutes is about to happen. They're not capable of looking at some screen and figuring out what it looks like when they get to 5 minutes. So what will happen in these cages, in these experiments, once they've realized that they roughly need to respond for 5 minutes, is they'll commit the behavioral patterns that you see in the lower right-hand corner, the black line, that many behaviors called scallops. They'll sort of sit in their cage, waiting until 5 minutes gets close to happening, and then they'll start to press. They'll press faster and faster and faster and faster, and more frantic until they get the reinforcement. They get that piece of food or whatever it is they're being reinforced with. Then they'll sit there for a long period of time doing nothing, just pausing until about 5 minutes starts to occur, and then they start to do that behavior again. They do it more and more and faster and faster and faster and spastic when they get really close to about that 5 minutes until they get the reinforcement. The variable interval schedule does not produce this pattern of response. If rats don't know how much time can pass, even if there's an average amount of time, like 5 minutes or so, like we just talked about before, they don't know how much time is going to pass, and it varies from reward to reward. What they get is something like you see in the green line. It's a very slow, deliberate pattern of responses. For rats in labs, what you see is them literally sitting next to whatever requires a response and just intermittently checking it. Pushing a button, or moving in a specific spot, or pushing down on a specific lever every now and then, just to make sure that if that behavior is being reinforced at that point in time, they're acting fast enough to get the reinforcement pretty shortly after it's being rewarded. It's not a frantic pace like we saw with the variable ratio schedule. It's just this slow, easy, consistent one. Again, much like with the ratio schedules, we see these things emerging in real life examples. The classic one, unfortunately, is what we see in many of our classrooms, where students put on fixed interval schedules when they know when they're going to have tests, when assignments are due, often, unfortunately, behave in the exact same patterns as we see in rats. When there isn't, say, a test coming up or a paper due, they maybe skip a few classes, or don't think about working on a paper, even if they've been instructed to do so. And they won't oftentimes do much until it starts getting pretty darn close to when those things are due. And then, much like the rats, they start pecking at the idea a little bit in advance, thinking about how to do it, and then they get a little bit more serious as that deadline starts to pop up, and they start getting frantic and start really freaking out and getting themselves to where their heart's beating and they're frantically trying to scurry to get everything done as fast as possible. And right after the test, you get that big pause. The scallop behaviors emerge in those situations. Then students that have been put on variable interval schedules exhibit the same behaviors as rats. There have been some professors in our history that have told students, you don't know when you're going to have a test. You don't know when you're going to have to do a paper. But occasionally, at some point in this class, these things will pop up. Those students tend to read their book almost every day, not freaking out, but just keeping on top of it. Tend to be looking at what certain assignments are every day, just keeping on top of it. And their behavior patterns, well, are almost identical to the rats in the labs. Some of you might be asking, well, if that's how it works, and you're indicating that's obviously much less stressful, why don't professors do this? Why don't professors put students on these variable interval schedules? I'm also guessing in the back of your head you're thinking, I really wouldn't want that, even if it's much less stressful and much easier to get me to continue doing my work. Well, that exact thought pattern is why many professors don't do it. In fact, rats exhibit the same preferences when they're in labs. When they're given two different levers that they could push, one on a variable interval schedule and one on a fixed interval schedule, they almost always prefer or go to the fixed interval schedule. And this is, again, a great way to show how we can apply what we see in the lab to many real-life situations, and when we use it, really expand the utility and application of operant conditioning. If we look at other things that have been explored over the years, what we see is that a lot of these behavioral principles, even though they're made more complex and start to deviate from the behavioral philosophies, have found their way into different branches of psychology. One of the areas that we see lots of applications of operant conditioning in is in educational psychology, or sometimes even developmental psychology. Lots of work has gone into looking at how long-term trends around reinforcement and punishment work when I look at children encountering specific environments. There's a lot of things that we've found that are probably worth noting before we finish this class. One of the things that many researchers have talked about is the need for immediacy when it comes to reinforcement and punishment, sort of like the need for immediacy that we had with classical conditioning. Right? If things aren't punished or reinforced quickly, those punishments, those reinforcers, have much less of a lasting impact. This is especially true for young children when we're looking at trying to modify or create specific behaviors. Another thing very closely linked to this is the fact that punishment seems to maybe be much more effective in the short run, but reinforcement seems to be something, if we're looking at creating more desirable behaviors, that's the optimal thing that needs to be incurred. If we're trying to understand it, many researchers cite the impacts that punishment had not only on rats but human beings. The terms frustration and exploration theories starts to pop up in educational circles when trying to not only explain how certain things impact behaviors, but why those things impact behaviors. This can also be said for something called vicarious conditioning, where we look at how learning through not our own experiences of operant conditioning, but those of others that we've observed, can change our behaviors. Numerous studies have shown that not only can humans vicariously learn very well in classrooms and other situations, but so can animals. Not only monkeys, but dogs and cats and numerous other species show an innate ability to pick up on not only their experiences, but the experiences of others. And all this, again, expands on the application and utility of operant conditioning. This is going to be where we're going to mark the end of this lecture. Hopefully now you have a better sense of what operant conditioning is all about, and also all the different areas that it applies. If you've done that, well, we've kind of reached the finish line of behaviorism and operant conditioning. There's still a lot more to explore, a lot of new ideas to try to tackle. But congratulations on getting to the end of this very first section. Hopefully you're ready to go as we move on to the next set of material. If you have any questions, make sure you ask either me or anybody else that can help with this stuff. In the meantime, take care, have a great day, and I'll see you soon.